Welcome to episode 49.
Hey, this is John Lee Dumas of EO Fire, and you're listening to Who Did That Voice, where we take an in-depth look at voiceovers.
It's a new year, and if you're like me, you are already thinking about warmer weather and taking that getaway to that tropical or exotic destination. Maybe you plan to travel to Walt Disney World or Universal Studios. No matter what kind of trip you plan, 3D Travel Company is the company for you. Just visit 3dtravelcompany.com and let them know that Trenton sent you from Who Did That Voice. Or you can book on www.whodidthatvoice.co and click the Book Now button. For a limited time, Who Did That Voice listeners can receive a Disney gift card for qualifying Disney and Universal trips booked and traveled by the end of 2017. Book today and travel away.
Welcome to Who Did That Voice, the show where we take an in-depth look at voiceover. And now, here's your host, Trenton Larkin.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today's special guest played Lady Jaye on the 1980s G.I. Joe.
We shouldn't be in here. Let's go.
Okay, follow me. What's the matter, you chicken?
I can't jump that far.
Okay, chicken, I'm leaving you here.
Use your head, Sally. Lady Jaye.
There's nothing chicken about being smart. If you stop and think, there's almost always a better way.
I use this plank
That's using your head.
instead of losing it. Now I know.
And knowing is half the battle.
G.I. Joe!
Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Who Did That Voice? Today on the show we have Mary McDonald Lewis, better known as Mary Mac. Mary, thanks so much for joining us today.
Trenton, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you on, so thank you for giving us some of your valuable time. We really appreciate it.
You bet.
Well, Mary, the very first thing that we always like to do when we have a special guest on the show is just to ask a little bit about who you are and how did you get into the voiceover industry as well?
Well, thanks, Trenton. I'll tell you, I didn't start out to be a voice actor. I became one, I think, kind of as a consequence of destiny almost. That is, it seems I just walked toward it and ended up being it. Not without a great deal of effort, but I'll tell you how. I'm the daughter of a Unitarian minister and a stage actor mother. And so I grew up with oration from the pulpit on Sunday mornings, and then performance from the stage on Saturday nights. It was a great childhood. I grew up around self-expression, speaking with one's true voice. This was quite natural to me. And I grew up with a love of theater as well. And so I was in theater in college and was doing some radio shows in Sacramento, where I grew up, and was also doing some readers theater at CSU Sacramento, which is my alma mater. I was graduated in the same generation, it's the same theater department generation that Tom Hanks did. We were in college together.
Fantastic.
And I know, it was great fun. He was a gifted lad even then. I had a love of voice. I already had a deep and profound love of voice. I was attracted to it. I was attracted to it more than being on stage, I was never interested in being an on-camera actor. Not because I thought it was dumb or stupid or disdained it in any way. I think it's awesome. I just never felt the passion. And then one day I went to a lecture by Harlan Ellison at Sac City, the community college in downtown Sacramento. I went with some pals, and afterwards I went up to congratulate him on an essay that I had read of his on the death of his dog. Now, Harlan Ellison is a tough little guy. He's a tough little sci-fi writer, and he's full of ire and fire, and he's a brilliant, brilliant cat. Instead of responding to my compliment, which this is an extremely heartfelt essay, you could see that inside this very tough little guy was a great tender spot for this dog of his. And I'm a dog lover and an animal rights activist and a vegetarian. And so it touched me on a number of different levels as well. Instead of responding to my compliment, he turned to me and he looked me in the eyes and he said, that voice, I want to put that voice in the Smithsonian Institution. And I kind of went, okay, well, thank you, Mr. Ellison. And then carried on from there. But I think a seed was planted at that moment. As well, on my last day of my radio show in Sacramento, the old radio guys, old-time radio guys that I was having lunch with at the radio station, they said to me, "Where did you get that voice?" And my answer, in all innocence, was, "What voice?" I had no idea what Harlan Ellison was talking about. I said, "Thank you," because I'm a good Sacramento girl, and I was excited and starstruck. But I really had no idea that my voice was unusual or to put a very fine point on it, marketable in any way. But something in me, I think, was already cooking. So left college, bummed around Europe for a year, and then came back and said, well, I guess I need to go do something now. And I moved to Los Angeles. So I'll leave more of the rest of the conversation for a little further in our conversation. But that's how I got started. That takes me to the top of the grapevine with my 16-foot long U-Haul, all my worldly possessions, with my Australian Shepherd Molly on the seat next to me, looking down into the city.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing such a warm and deep story. And, it's fantastic when you're able to learn where somebody comes from, because it kind of helps where they, how they got to where they are by knowing their beginnings. So I really appreciate that, Mary Mac.
Thank you, Trenton. And I think that's helpful for all of us. We are all, whether or not, let's say you're a youngster and you've got your eye on a career in voice acting, yes, these kinds of stories are extremely helpful. But I'll tell you, I think that's why we tune into the TED Talks. I'm not necessarily looking for a new career, although I never say no to new ideas, but I'm always looking for new inspiration. And hearing the story behind the story, I think, gets all of us fired up. I think that's why The Moth is taking off. I think that's why TED is so popular, why storytelling in general is so popular, and why the art of memoir is so popular right now.
Absolutely.
We're all, we're looking for inspiration.
I totally agree with you, Mary. I really do. Because when we know somebody's passion and we understand where they're coming from because of that passion, it just makes us that more passionate about that individual or that topic. Back in 1984, you got to play the iconic Lois Lane on a show called The Legendary Superpowers Show. And what was that like for you playing on that show? And was that your first voiceover job?
Playing Lois Lane on Super Friends was, in fact, my first voiceover job. And so that makes my mother union SAG, Screen Actors Guild, because Screen Actors Guild at that time and for many years up until the recent merger covered all animation because it was shot on film. So that made it a Screen Actors Guild job as opposed to an AFTRA job, which covers radio. And so you would think that because it was voice, it would be the one union, but in fact it was the other. I knew from the time I started out as a voice actor, started out taking workshops in LA with the great Tom Clay, studied with Maurice Tobias and many of the other greats. I knew, as somebody who believes in democracy, as somebody who believes in social justice, as somebody who's a fighter for the working woman and man, those are my Unitarian roots showing again, that I wanted to be in our great union, that I wanted to join a union. I wanted to be with the best workers in the land, the highest professionals. I wanted to stand again shoulder to shoulder and fight for the collective rather than as an individual. I also wanted the full force of the union at my back in case I got into trouble. I wanted that great bank of lawyers. I wanted my pension and health care. So you can imagine how I felt when I got my first union job, right?
Yeah.
And to play Lois Lane, I mean, I grew up with Noelle Neal, if I'm recalling her name correctly, I should, who was the Lois Lane that we know from the old George Reeves Superman, the black and white Superman that was on TV back when the Earth's crust was still cooling. And so here I get to play the first of many pop icons, pop cultural icons. Lois was my first one. She was already an icon. And I got to work alongside the people who became my friends, but I was a baby voice actor and was cast because I sounded like Margot Kidder, who had just gotten done playing Lois Lane in the film. And I got to be right alongside these guys at the mic who were my heroes, my absolute heroes. And then also I got to join the union. My first tour of the union, when you joined, you in LA, you got a tour of the union and you were introduced to the union. And I was given a tour by a man who I later became a national board member with, Daryl Anderson, who has done many things throughout his life, but I already knew him as Animal on the Lou Grant Show. So I show up at the union for my little tour, and I'm already given a tour by somebody who I've been seeing on TV and see regularly on TV. And that was when the penny dropped for me. That was when I knew that I was in Valhalla. I was in the company of giants, and I think some part of me knew that this was going to be my life. But at that point, I felt like, Dorothy walking through the door, going in to see the Great Oz.
Wow. That's pretty epic.
It was epic.
Well, and you talked about being on a show with such amazing voice actors that were, more established since you were such a baby voiceover actress. Mm-hmm. And what was it like working with Adam West and BJ Ward and Frank Welker on that show? And I know there were tons of others, but there those
were
three specifically.
Of others. Of course, Adam West I already knew from Batman, and he was funny and dry and wry and respectful and kind. Frank and BJ became longtime friends because we all went on to G.I. Joe. BJ Ward as Scarlet and Frank Welker as everything, including the tanks and the guns and the birds in the trees and the choppers. There's no voice that Frank couldn't play. Frank is one of the sweetest people you could ever meet. He had a place at that time out in way out on the west side of Los Angeles, way past the valley out toward, Simi Valley, Calabasas, out that way. And by God, of all people, he found a little fawn. And he came into G.I. Joe talking about his fawn and showing us pictures of him. And we all thought to ourselves, of course he would find a fawn. We're surprised he didn't find Thumper out in his woods. The wonderful thing is that all of those guys who I met on Lois Lane, we just iterated. We iterated to these various shows, and then new guys would come in just as I had done. And it was the golden age of animation, through the very, very, very late 70s, early 80s, and all through the 80s. I think that after that, cartoons, I think they're still awesome and amazing. I'm on one now, but they were so sparky and spunky. They were starting to get brave and edgy, but they were still innocent. They weren't cynical. This was pre Beavis and Butthead, I think that the great descendants of our cartoons in the 80s, I would say American Dad, I would say South Park is a child of the parents that we were a part of. Certainly Archer. Things began to be bold in the 80s, but they weren't mean and they weren't gross,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you kind of touched on it briefly, Mary Mac. You were talking about G.I. Joe, and you did play on the original show, which aired in 1985 as Lady Jaye. And what was it like playing that heroic woman who was pretty hardcore and kick butt?
Yo, Joe. I started to say as Lois Lane, that was kind of also the beginning of my typecasting as that kind of spunky, and then later quite brave. But the characters I've played have always been either very, very good or very, very bad, They were either heroes or villains. At that time, as you recall, there was also the My Little Ponies of the world. And my friends, my women friends with these beautiful, light, sort of floral voices, they were working like crazy on those shows. And whereas I was always on these rough and tumble shows, and that suited me just fine. So I went into the audition for G.I. Joe. I was teaching ESL as my day job during that time, English as a second language, something I taught for 12 years through the Glendale Unified School District, Adult Ed, ESL, in the evenings, which allowed me to go out daytimes for my voiceover auditions and so forth. But I taught it for 12 years to immigrants from all over the world, and they come home from their jobs and they'd wash the grease out from underneath their fingernails and they'd come trooping to class. And it's a time that's very, very, very dear to me. And not only supported me as I moved into this other world, but it was a place of love and learning and laughter, and I treasure it very much. I highly recommend that job to anybody who's interested in pursuing something full of heart and meaning. So I had to sneak away. I had to sneak in a sub to cover my class, and I went to auditions. The line for the auditions snaked around the block, and these were invited auditions.
Wow.
Every voice actor, remember at that time, voice actors only lived in Los Angeles and New York. And they were about equally split, I would say. In New York held the corner on commercial work, particularly the large luxury items, the cars, the perfumes. It was where the big, old, long-time ad agencies were. We had the corner and have the corner on animation on the West Coast. So every actor in town was there. Every actor worth their salt for a show that was going to we employed a lot of actors, but the core group was maybe a dozen. And so I got in line and saw my pals, and I went in to audition for a much smaller role. I don't know if you've spoken with Wally Burr yet.
I haven't, and I heard he recently had a stroke, so I haven't had the honor.
Yeah, hopefully you'll reach out to him. Wally's in his 90s now.
Yeah.
And we'll just have to see. We're aware that he's not feeling great at the moment, but one always hopes, and I hope you can reach out to him and get some of those stories. He's a character.
I'd love to have him on the show. He's a fantastic director, and
yeah,
I know he's done acting as well, and it's just he's a well-rounded man. So
youngest tank commander in World War II.
I know. I think that's fantastic.
And that's why he was so suited for G.I. Joe. He knew war. He was a World War II man,
Yeah.
So he had me come in, and like the commander-in-chief that he was, began having me yell. And I auditioned for the little part that I was auditioning for. And then he said, hey, take a look at this other part. What was your name again? Mary McDonald Lewis? Okay, Mary Mac. And that's where the nickname came from.
Fantastic.
Because he was likening me to the Monitor and the Merrimac, the two steel-sided battleships in the Civil War.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Merrimac, why don't you read this audition? And so I read for Lady Jaye, and he heard something that he liked. And he asked me to step back from the mic and step back from the mic, keep yelling. Look out, run, duck, hide, yo, Joe, and so forth. And I brought it, I was all in. And I think his mind was made up before my sound ceased echoing in a very non-echoey sound studio.
Well, I've heard Wally Burr was a man who knew what he wanted, and if he didn't hear what he wanted, he would tell you until you got it right. So for him to have decided that with you, he really heard something. He absolutely was just like, this is it. This is what I was thinking in my head. Because Wally was a man who knew what he wanted. So
he did. And
that's fantastic.
The same was true for the casting of everybody in that show. We were all really ideally suited to our roles.
Well, I think that's fantastic. And people aren't going to be able to see this because it is a podcast, but I think you have your likeness is very much Lady Jaye, which is pretty cool. So
isn't that just the craziest thing ever? Oh my God. And it's not like I played a cartoon character in 1985 and I've been frantically mimicking her ever since.
Yeah.
No, I looked like this when I walked in the door, except a whole lot younger.
That's fantastic.
Short red hair, angular Celtic face, same kind of body type. In fact, we went to a party at the studio. It was a launch party for the show, and I was talking to some animators, and they said, "Oh, who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm one of the voices on the show." "Oh, who do you play?" These are the animators, mind you. And I said, "I play Lady Jaye." And they said, "You're Lady Jaye?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Wait here." I hadn't seen her drawings yet. And they came back and showed me these two drawings, which I have to this very day, of Lady Jaye in two different positions with her little crossbow. And I looked down at her, and she and I were about the same age at that time, too.
Wow.
Right? So we would have both have been in our late 20s, early 30s, let's say. Yeah, I would have been 32. So they looked at me, and I looked at them, and we both looked at the picture, and we were like, that's weird. What we didn't know was that 30 years later, that would still be the case. and that it would bring so much happiness, that the resemblance would bring so much happiness to the fans.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
It does tickle them.
Well, it tickles me. It is fantastic to see, because you still sound like Lady Jaye, and you still look like Lady Jaye. So it's, I mean, not that voiceover is cast on appearance at all, but it's just fantastic. The coincidence is just, it's uncanny.
Strange thing. Yeah.
But, you know, with G.I. Joe, I know that Community, the comedy show, brought you into their show to play Scarlet. Any particular reason, do you know why they didn't have you play Lady Jaye? I was kind of curious about that.
Yeah. And why didn't they just get BJ to play Scarlet, for God's sakes?
I was kind of like, why did they do that? Because they had Duke, Michael Bell, and then they had
Billy
Flint.
Ratner.
Yeah. So I was like, why did they put you as Scarlet? But hey, at least they brought you back. But I was kind of thinking, why didn't they bring BJ and Mary Mac back?
And Morgan Lofting as the bottleness.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, all the great women. And that, I think, is something that's really important to note, is that there were awesome women, awesome, strong women. You know, we predated Firefly, the great Joss Whedon and his crew. We predated, you know, any of the shows that later came. Well, in fact, we contributed to their creation. Yeah. Lady Jaye, by the way, is the first short-haired superhero in the body, in the corpus. Quite possibly almost the only one, if not the only one. So she wasn't sexualized. She wasn't designed to please the male gaze, as it were, to use the most modern feminist language, which I am, as you could guess, a staunch feminist. But she was her own woman. You know, I love that about her. I'm very disappointed to see what they've done. You know, she has been you know, pulled into the mire of fetishization now, but still, the original Lady Jaye stands as a moral and an example, I hope, and maybe the pendulum will swing back.
Absolutely. So there's a show that has a huge following, Mary Mac, called Batman the Animated Series. And that show ran from 1992 to 95. And you played Mavin in 3 different episodes, who happened to be Selena Kyle's, a.k.a. Catwoman's best friend and confidant. And what was your experience like working with that great cast and working with Andrea Romano?
Well, Andrea, you know, I describe my generation of voice actors and the crew that makes up that tribe. So Sue Blue, also a stunning voice actor, but director as well, as you know. Andrea, you know, all of the Ginny McSwain, you know, certainly Gordon Hunt. You know, Wally Burr, everybody that was around at that time. We really are Gen 1.5. Gen 1.5, consider it, because radio had only been around for less than 50 years when we broke into the business. Radio shows up in the, it begins being quite popular through FDR's era. Certainly it was used beforehand, but we can only say maybe the 30s. So we're looking at 50 years of radio. The greats in animation, the people who started animation, were still working when I came in. Don Messick and Dawes Butler were still working at Hanna-Barbera. Mel Blanc was still making magic. Gary Owens was still working. Joni Gerber, June Foray. These were the folks who were in their senior year of college when we freshmen came in. So we are connected to the great founding mothers and fathers. And this continued with Batman. It certainly continued on another show that I just adored that was connected to Brave Star, called Sherlock Holmes in the 21st Century. And I played Mike, a character who was a descendant of Mycroft Holmes. Andrea was a marvelous, marvelous director. She was always very dry, very funny, very straightforward. You know, the women at that time had to come up in a world of men, and so they did not suffer fools gladly. So they were tough. But because it was show business, they still got to be quirky and funny. And Romano was a genius. She was a genius director, and she was a genius when those shows were being cut together. And I think that Batman certainly, certainly G.I. Joe could have been a success 40 years earlier as radio dramas. That's how good they were.
Absolutely. I totally
And
agree with that.
right?
Yeah.
And that I think is a measure of the director's skill set, to a very large extent.
Absolutely. And I wholeheartedly agree with you because of the sound quality and the sound effects. And I know how they specialize those for each episode. They would have come across fantastic as just radio dramas.
Exactly.
And the music was always so riveting and like heart-wrenching
fantastic.
and just,
That's
definitely
right.
got to you.
It might as well have been John Williams. I mean, it was very, very well done.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Mary Mac, what kind of advice would you give to someone who might be interested in joining the voiceover world?
Sure. Before we go on to that, I just want to touch on two other voice jobs that that I've enjoyed. You know, I've talked about having this this great fortune in playing these pop icons.
Yeah.
And I'm so delighted to say that that's sort of never stopped. I don't know what I'll be saying on my last breath, but I'm sure I'll be caught mid-sentence when my time comes. But you know, I was the voice of OnStar when it first began, and was in fact the voice of that system for 10, 12, 14 years.
Wow.
I was the first regularly working first union voice in speech recognition in history, and I worked with the great linguists who came out of Stanford University in Silicon Valley, who were designing these systems. It certainly wasn't called OnStar. It was called Serengeti. It was called Portico. And folks can look that up on Wikipedia. It's a really fascinating story, how these systems were developed and how I participated traveling down to San Jose on the Nerd Bird here from Portland, Oregon, every week to contribute millions of prompts to the system. And that was exciting work. And so to be the voice that said, "Welcome to OnStar," was pretty wonderful.
Wow, that's fantastic.
And then the other, you know, more recent turn of events was I was brought on the show Archer last year to play a character named Veronica Dean, and she's fabulous. She's kind of a cross between Lauren Bacall and Rita Hayworth and Veronica Lake, you know, sort of with the hair falling over her eyes, and she's always talking about Mr. Archer, you know, and she's quite wonderful, and so. And then, of course, Archer's crew is always making the most vulgar jokes about Veronica Dean and her aging body parts because Archer's mad about her because he has Oedipal feelings about older women in general. And not only am I thrilled to be making another generation happy, and even still some of the guys and girls who watch G.I. Joe are watching Archer, so that makes me super happy. But also last year when I was taping the show in New York, Jessica Walters had the session just before me, so I got to spend some time talking to her, and she's my hero, and that was a thrill for me. So for me, after 30 plus years in the business, the thrills never stop. The passion has never ceased. I'm always excited, and it doesn't matter whether it's a commercial spot for a local auto dealer or which I'm actually doing. I'm doing some work for an auto detailer after I get off the phone with you. But then in early September, I did a giant NFL film remembering the place of the NFL right around 9/11 and in the days following. So I move through this world always grateful, never bored, happy to be working on the little guys and the medium guys and the big guys, and just grateful and in a place of gratitude every single day.
Absolutely.
So a lot of people ask me for advice about breaking into the voiceover game. And what I would say is, first and foremost, yes, indeed, if that's your passion, then by all means, you should pursue it. And you should never, ever, ever, ever listen to anybody who poo-poos your passion. It doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter why they're saying it, and it certainly doesn't matter who they are. I don't care if they're your mama, your papa, your husband, your girlfriend. It doesn't matter to me, and it should not matter to you. Proceed full speed ahead. And I would say that applies if you want to be a farrier, a horseshoer, if you want to work in construction, if you want to work in infrastructure in a city and build subways, if you want to be a doctor in Bangkok, if you want to work with Habitat for Humanity, go for the gold. Never, ever falter in your footsteps. So let's talk about the practicalities. Passion is all well and good. Do you have talent? Well, you'll only find out through class, taking class, and lots of it. Shut up. I know what you're thinking. Shut up right now. Not you, Trenton, the listeners. Still your voice, still your voice. No, your giant talent, your unmistakable talent is not, quiet, be quiet now. Listen to me, eyes on me. Your unmistakable talent is not going to get you into the game. Repeat after me. My unmistakable talent is not going to get me into the game. Good, great, awesome. Now that we know that, we can do what we're supposed to do. Every human being on this planet has a certain obligation to themselves. The way is always rough, steep, and thorny. There's no easy way to get anywhere in this life. There's a price to pay. And it's a good price. It's an important price. It's the price you pay to learn what you have to learn, to collect and gather with you those moral ideals that are going to give you comfort in the night. If you haven't built your spine, your backbone, then you assuredly won't have it when times get tough. And if you happen to stumble across an easy time, if some guy casts you in something and you haven't earned your stripes, well, when that guy leaves you in the dust for the next new flavor of the week, you won't survive that. So all the hard times you go through, all the effort that you put in, all of the lessons that you learn have been put in front of you specifically to equip you for what comes next and to allow you to maybe stay in the game for a year, 2 years, 5 years, your whole life. So class. Oh, and then also more class. Remember what we talked about, your unmistakable talent. Keep going. Don't give up. Do other things that you love, other things that you feel passionate about, other things that give you joy. If you like tending bar, then go tend, get your bartender's license and go tend bar. If you like teaching ESL as I did, go do that. If you like being a river raft guide, go do that. If you must, let's say you don't like cleaning houses, you just don't happen to care for it. Some people do, they adore it and it nourishes them. But let's say you yourself don't like it and it's the only job that's out there. Learn to love it. Find something that you love about it. That's on you, my friend. If you don't like your job and you're not willing to change it, you have to reframe the problem. Find something to love about what you're doing no matter what, because it's going to take you a long time to be working in the business. So that's the place to start. Class. You must support yourself. I do not believe in living in poverty myself, because when you're poor, chaos is only one step away. Chaos is a flat tire away. So I don't think you have to be poor to have a dream. You can have a dream and pursue your passion, but be smart and apply yourself. Yes, you're going to be tired. Who cares? Does your passion matter that much? Well, then sleep when you can. You know, here's the thing, Trenton, and I know I'm going on, but I also work as a dialect coach in film and television, and that's something I've been doing for the past 10 or 15 years, not necessarily because my work tapered off as a voice actor. It hasn't. It never has. And not at all because I got tired of voice acting. I haven't. I adore it. But this work came along because I'm really good at dialects. And when it started coming along, I immediately recognized that I loved it and that it was a new profession that I wished to add to my voice work. And I engaged in some deep training. I'm still in training. I'm taking a workshop 2 weekends from now on the Arabic accent, which I already coach, but I need to know more about. I work on set. I'm 63 years old. I work on set for 10, 12, 14 hours a day. I work in the weather sometimes in New York where it's freezing cold, sometimes here in Portland. The work travels to Vancouver. It's all over the place.
Wow.
I could be standing in the rain, pouring rain under a tent, dressed appropriately, of course, but standing up at my age for hours upon hours upon hours, right?
Yeah.
And so my point is, if I can do it, anyone can do it. There's no excuse for not putting in the 10 or 12-hour days if it's what you want to be doing.
Absolutely.
So in conclusion, I will say, have in your head that you want to be a voice actor. Yay. But then have life. Rock the journey. Know that wishing it so won't make it happen, and that just makes you a dork. You have to work on it. You have to build it with your own two hands. You have to make it happen. And once you do, if you do, because you might not, and that's okay too, because you'll have developed other things and you'll have found other passions along the way. If you do manage to build this of your own two hands, or whatever it is you built of your own two hands, you can feel so proud about that. And you can say, I didn't give up, and I've created something that's uniquely me. It's my own fingerprint. It's my own snowflake. There's no other that in the world. It's worth the effort, in my opinion, whether you're going to become a horseshoer or a voice actor.
Well, I totally agree with you, Mary Mac. I have one final question for you today, and we will let you go. What is the legacy that you want to leave behind?
The legacy I want to leave behind is very simple. I want to have participated in saving the world. My motto is, tell a story, save the world. I am at base a storyteller, and it doesn't matter if it's behind the microphone or if I'm directing a show on stage, as I often do, acting on stage, as I sometimes do, helping an actor, helping Patrick Stewart tell his story on Green Room, as I did a couple of years ago, gave him his first American accent. I'm a storyteller, and what I want to talk about are important things that matters, things that have to do with our humanity in such a way that we look down at the earth beneath our feet, we feel the breeze along the back of our neck, we feel the fire with the back of our hands, we watch the pure water move across our line of sight, and we say, it's my job to steward this magnificent place. What a blessing. The only thing I care about, Trenton, is saving the world. And what that means for me is stewarding Mother Earth, loving her, loving one another, and caring for and honoring, embracing and cradling, protecting and defending all of God's creatures. It sounds like a big thing, but it's really not, because I'm doing it one story at a time.
Absolutely, Mary Mac. That's a fantastic legacy, and I definitely applaud you for that. Thank you so much for your valuable time today. Would you just give us a closeout today as Lady Jaye?
I want you to join the army of planet savers. Captain Flint, Shipwreck, Scarlet, me, and all of the rest of the Joes. We've joined an army to save this planet. Together we can do it. Are you in? Now you know, and knowing is half the battle. Yo, Joe!
Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed today's episode with Mary Mac, the voice of Lady Jaye. And if you did, please stop on by my Facebook or Twitter pages by searching Who Did That Voice? I would love to hear from you. You know, a question you might ask yourself is, where can I listen to Who Did That Voice? That's an excellent question. You can hear us on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, TuneIn Radio, YouTube, and our website at www.whodidthatvoice.co. Click the Episodes tab and listen away. Well, everyone, that's all the time we have for this episode. Join us this Friday for our next special guest, Ian James Corlett, the voice of Mega Man from the 1990s, Cheetor from Beast Wars, and so much more. You won't want to miss this episode. Hey, do you ask yourself who did that voice? Well, if you do, go to our website, www.whodidthatvoice.co, and click on the Episodes tab. Choose an actor, pick their name, and see pictures from the different characters they've voiced in their career.
Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next time for more discoveries on Who Did That Voice.